colleagues, distinguished guests, I warmly welcome you to this UNFF side event on international forest governance, hosted by UFRO, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. My name is John Parata. I'm the current president of UFRO. For those of you who may not know us very well, UFRO is the global network for forest science collaboration. We connect more than 600 member organizations in over 120 countries worldwide, and we represent collectively about 15,000 scientists in all fields of forest science. One of the very important activities that UFRO engages in is through our science policy program, which has been established to support evidence-based decision-making in international political forums related to forests, such as the UNFF. Today, our science policy program is presenting its most recent report on international forest governance, a critical review of trends, drawbacks, and new approaches, which we will launch and discuss today. I will now hand over to Christoph Wildberger, the coordinator of our science policy program. Christoph?
Yes, thank you very much, John. The core activity of our science policy program is to consolidate scientific information related to forests, and we carry out scientific assessments on issues of high global concern, and we share the outcomes of these assessments as widely as possible with stakeholders and decision makers like you. The present report we are publishing today is based on previous work we have done. In 2010, we carried out a scientific assessment on the international forest regime in the framework of the Global Forest Expert Panels program, the joint initiative of the CPF, which we are leading. The findings of this report showed that international forest governance is complex, it's fragmented. The core problems of international forest governance are cross-sectoral, and we need synergistic and integrated approaches to solve them. Since 2010, a lot of things have happened. I mean, you saw them, especially the number of the actors, the number of initiatives, arrangements, and institutions that are working in the international forest governance arena has increased considerably. And we have decided we need to update the information and analyze the whole environment of international forest governance since 2010. The new report now that we are presenting today, the report starts analyzing the whole tendency, the trends, the challenges, and also the potential approaches to solve challenges from 2010 onwards, and shows us what the scientific literature has to say in this regard. I would like to, before I'll introduce our keynote speakers, I would like to let you know that we will hear presentations of two lead authors of the report, and then we will have statements of two stakeholders that we have invited to respond to the findings of the report. And then we will ask you to take the floor and discuss with us and get into discussion on the findings we have. Yeah, with that, it's my pleasure actually to introduce to you two keynote speakers, two renowned scientists. Next to me on the podium is Daniela Kleinschmidt. She's a professor of forest and environmental policy in Freiburg at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And she's one of the lead authors of the study, and she's also the vice president of IUFRO. Together with her, our colleague Connie McDermott will introduce the outcomes of the study. Unfortunately, Connie could not come to New York. We wanted to connect her virtually, but due to technical issues, we have to show a recording, unfortunately. Connie is a professor and Jackson Senior Research Fellow in Land Use and Environmental Change at Oriel College and the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Yes, with that, actually, I give the floor to Daniela and ask her to introduce the findings of our assessment.
Okay, that is my great pleasure. Welcome as well from my side. My name is Angela Kleinschmidt. Thanks a lot for the introduction, for the kind words. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here in this room and to give a presentation about our report. And it's as already said, it's a two-person presentation from Connie McDermott and myself. This week, that has already been said, this report was launched, and it was an effort not only of Connie and myself, so that sounds pretty doable, but it is an effort of 38 authors, and I want to acknowledge all of those right away to say that it wouldn't have possible without those. So I'm very happy that we have this strong group, and it was a real pleasure to work together. We have had 4 editors and as well 8 reviewers to ensure that it is evidence-based science, and we got really good constructive reviews from them. We already have had a large media echo, so we are quite happy about that. So that is promising, and I hope that keeps you awake for the rest of the presentation. And I would like to let you know what's in it. So in case you don't want to read all these pages, and I haven't counted those, and I haven't counted the literature we have reviewed, even though I've been asked by many media journalists about the numbers of articles behind those, but it's many. So what we do is an update. Christoph has already mentioned that. And what we do here is, and you can see that in the back on the slide, we want to show you the different chapters involved. So we want to say something about the key trends, a particular focus on finances, a particular focus on discourses and on critique and alternatives for international forest governance. So that is the main format. And as you know, it's all about governance. We maybe should say short word, a brief introduction about what we mean by governance. And governance for us is formal as well as informal bundles of rules, roles and relationships that define and regulate the social practices of state, but as well non-state actors in international forest affairs, of course. When it comes to the why and the how, Christoph has already announced why we are doing it and what we are going and what is behind it. What we are doing is, so I start with the method, is a synthesis of existing literature. So it's not an own study. We don't do document analysis. We don't do interviews. What we do is a review of existing literature from the last 14 years. And that sounds a bit of trivial, but it's quite a lot of literature which is out there. And some parts are hidden, so it's not so obvious. And we try to streamline that a little bit and categorize and to make it readable and channelize it in a way. What we can see there is so that we have as well changes in the scientific discourse. I think that is important to mention. You have realized already changes in the political discourse, and there are slight changes, but there is as well changes in the scientific discourse, and that means there is different actors coming in, different researchers. So while it was in 2010 mainly dominated by political science and governance researchers, now there is many more disciplines integrated in this study. And there is, for example, geographers and others, which brings as well new perspectives and new, rules to the game and new ideas as well and concepts we have included. And you will see that because that has quite a critical lens in our report here. We do have the objective to summarize the trends and the findings and inform the political process as we try to do now. We try to identify key challenges and scientific critiques and, of course, help as well to create some new ideas. This is the part from my side. I'll come back in later for the next chapters, but first up to Connie from Oxford University and one of the lead authors here. Unfortunately not live, but we are happy to see her on video.
Hello, everyone. Today I'll be providing an overview of chapters 2 and 3 of the latest of 2 IUFRO reports on international forest governance. Chapter 2 summarizes key governance trends over the last 14 years since the first report. Chapter 3 assesses the evolving landscape of forest-related finance. So beginning with Chapter 2, I'll highlight 5 key trends. The first is an overall growth in scope and ambition. We see a growing range of international institutions, processes, and agreements that are directly or indirectly aimed at governing forests and land use. For example, the 2015 UN Sustainable Development Goals cover a broad range of social, economic, and environmental priorities relevant to forest governance. Under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, there is the 30 by 30 target to protect 30% of the planet for nature by 2030. There are new commitments to achieving net zero carbon emissions and net zero deforestation, and lately, increasing numbers of efforts to remove deforestation from a range of internationally traded commodities. Another key trend has been an expansion of increasingly ambitious quantitative targets and pledges to the point where you might call it a type of target Olympics. Why would we say that? Well, let's give a few examples. There's the 2021 Glasgow Forest Pledge to end deforestation and land degradation by 2030. This is broader in scope and even more ambitious than the New York Declaration on Forests 7 years earlier. We have the new 30-30 targets for nature under the CBD just mentioned, and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals include 169 targets. The list of targets and the scope and scale of ambition continues to grow, even when we've yet to meet existing targets, and there is often a lack of clarity on how the targets will be achieved. A third trend highlighted in the report is a further shift of decision-making beyond the forest sector. So in terms, for example, of global conventions, the UNFFC on climate and the CBD have played very influential roles in shaping international agendas for forests. These include strategies and targets to address forests as major sources and sinks of carbon. In fact, some people call this the climatization of forests that can potentially obscure other forest values. At the same time, the CBD has set ambitious targets for protecting ecosystems, including but not limited to forests. We also see a growing focus on cross-sectoral approaches that address particularly the key role of agricultural expansion in driving forest loss. A fourth trend, highlighted in both Chapter 2 and 3 of the report, is the increasing dominance of market-based approaches. These are approaches that aim to harness the economic power of markets to incentivize or enforce environmental and social values, for example, through corporate social responsibility, sustainability certification, markets for forest carbon, and zero deforestation trade regulations. Some see these strategies as a means to fast-track action by bypassing the need for intergovernmental or broader stakeholder consensus. Okay, so given these first 4 trends, what can we say about how they are shaping the priorities and effectiveness of international forest governance? As an example, let's look at the interactions between the 3 trends of climatization, the expansion of quantitative targets, and market-based approaches. The report finds that over the last 14 years, the UNFFC has developed a relatively comprehensive set of rules for results-based measurements of forest carbon. Decisions have also been made on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that outlines the rules for international transfer and trade of mitigation outcomes to meet emission reduction targets. In other words, there is a relatively complete architecture to facilitate international carbon finance and trade to meet targets. Research on the effectiveness of these efforts in terms of reducing forest carbon emissions, as summarized, for example, in the latest 2022 IUFRO report on REDD+, reveals mixed and inconclusive evidence, depending in part on whether one considers only deforestation or also considers forest degradation. Meanwhile, in regards to other non-carbon values, these are addressed through safeguards, but without targets or specific trade requirements. We don't see arguments in the literature that other values necessarily should or could be quantified in the same way, but it does highlight how the focus on measuring and valuing forest carbon can obscure these many other environmental and social priorities. The combination of climatization with quantitative targets and market-based approaches is also evident in a variety of compliance and voluntary markets for forest carbon. At the same time, and very importantly from a governance perspective, there has been a proliferation of carbon standards and verification systems trying to ensure that forest carbon markets have high integrity. And yet, despite this proliferation, we see ongoing and even greater controversy over their effectiveness. A fifth trend identified in Chapter 2 of the report is a shift from global to regional and unilateral approaches. A growing percentage of international forest agreements, estimated about 75%, are regional level. There's also been an expansion of unilateral trade-based policies, meaning policies that a country or group of countries make that address issues of forest governance in external or foreign countries. The EU timber regulation is one example that requires due diligence to ensure no illegal timber is placed on the EU market. So in this case, the idea is to reinforce the laws of countries outside the EU as well as in the EU. More recently, the EU deforestation regulation takes this a step further and has requirements for due diligence to ensure no deforestation, whether legal or illegal in the country of origin, that is associated with imports of cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil palm, rubber, soya, or wood. So what does the literature have to say about all 5 of these trends in terms of their effectiveness, for what and for whom? One common theme is an observation of how market-based approaches can reinforce inequalities already embedded in global trade. When it comes to agricultural commodities, for example, a relatively few large-scale enterprises capture a large share of the economic value of global trade. These same patterns have been observed in the so-called green trade that aims to internalize environmental values. Let's take, for example, Ghanaian cocoa farmers. Cocoa farmers receive an estimated 3 to 7% of the value of a chocolate bar, down from 50% in the 1970s. They lack secure land rights and rights to the native trees growing on their farms, and they are suffering heavily from climate change. Meanwhile, they're experiencing a layer of one on top of another of sustainability standards and requirements, from certification to forest carbon schemes, to new requirements to verify no deforestation. This layering of international market-based requirements crowds out domestic and local priorities for securing livelihoods. It also conflicts with growing demands for decentralization of decision-making and recognition of indigenous rights and knowledge. Hence, the report and the literature it reviews emphasizes the need to rethink international forest governance and place more emphasis on ground-up and inclusive strategies. Okay, now let's move on to Chapter 3, on the landscape for forest finance. There are some common themes in this chapter that echo Chapter 2. The growing dominance of market-based approaches is part of a broader financialization of forest governance. Financialization refers to how markets, actors, and institutions are playing an increasing role in land-based economies. This has been very notable in the forest sector. Institutional investment in forests and forestry has increased from about US 10 to 15 billion in the early 2000s to over US 100 billion today. Along with this has come a complex and growing financial architecture, including many different forms of finance for a wide range of activities, as well as new rules and standards aiming to define green or sustainable finance. It's also important to note that despite this complexity, often a relatively few actors have outsized influence within or across sectors. The UNFF Clearinghouse on Forest Finance provides some very useful information on types and quantities of forest finance and who directly receives the finance. However, the data available is still quite limited, making it difficult to determine more specifically what activities are being funded and where the money ultimately lands. For example, in the graph on the right, it shows only 4% of funds going directly to community-based organizations, but presumably some of the other investments are delivering community benefits. Finally, to conclude this presentation, if we combine the findings of Chapters 2 and 3, forest finance faces a major conundrum. On the one hand, and as highlighted in a recent UNEP report, public and private finance flowing into activities considered harmful to nature amount to some $7 trillion globally on an annual basis. This swamps the estimated $200 billion per year invested in nature-based solutions. What Chapter 2 and 3 suggest, however, is that this should not be interpreted simply as a call for new markets and more money faster. Rather, if what we are aiming for is to transform international forest governance to support a sustainable future, it is critical to address underlying governance challenges. This includes addressing major social inequalities in access to forests, land, and resources. In other words, to draw on the fable of the tortoise and the hare, sometimes going slower, steadier, and more carefully will get us there faster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Connie. I hope you can hear us online, though you have been not here. So great. We will continue with the next slides, please. Here we go. So the next chapter is about the discourses and the development of discourses over time, and as the whole chapter is, this is as well building on the report we have had before. So it's an update from 2010. What we have had already 2010, what we have acknowledged in the environmental meta discourses, so these are the broad discourses we have globally, and this is all about environment. We have seen there was a modernity discourse very strongly after the Second World War. We have had the limits to growth report and discourse. Many of you have known already that part. And the ecological modernization discourse, and finally sustainable development discourses. Those are all discourses that have been there already for a long time, and they have been not fully diminished, but often they have sort of overlaid by other discourses. And what we have seen now since 2010 is that the climatization has taken over. So the climate discourse took over as a meta discourse and is then affecting all kinds on forest problematization as well, which means like it is how forests are problematized, what to do with forests is problematized in a way that it is induced by climate change and the climate discourse. And the second one, what we can see there as well, this is the ecological modernization that took over after the limits to growth report, saying that, okay, on the one hand, we are aware there are maybe limits to growth, but on the other hand, there are possibilities to build as well for the future and to have a growth, but without really compromising the environment. And this is still there, so we can see that, and it's still relevant in international forest governance, emphasizing the market aspects and the market-based governance instruments, saying that there is a reliance on profits as well. So we need to work with the markets in order to work with forest and to do the governance situation with the forest internationally. And with this as well, climate and the forest are presented as a business opportunity in this discourse. Very contrastingly, we see as well that this growth debate within the ecological modernization is still continuing, but it is on a broader scale, and it's more varied from a degrowth to a pro-growth discourse, so we can have growth to we should better not have growth, kind of discussions we can find when we talk about international forest governance. So should we continue and should we, well, focus on growth perspective, having market economics behind that, or should we rather have new discourses that are focusing on degrowth or regrowth? What you can see here, so that were the meta discourses, and these are the forest discourses, so they are really only on forest, and they are quite importantly affected by the prominent or dominant discourses like the climate change discourse. And as Connie already said earlier in the presentation, there is a climatization of the forest discourse. We can see that, so in all kinds of ways about tradable carbon sinks is the most important issue when it comes to the actual discourses we have in forestry. We have as well still discourses on sustainable forest management, so they are continued, but that was much, much more important when it came to the report from 2010, and it is much more criticized nowadays. The critiques we see in the literature is about it is a Western-oriented ideal, it is very vague because it's not really defining on what we are going to do there, and it's sidelining broader definitions, which is more inclusive. So there is some more critiques on sustainable forest management. New discourses who have raised a lot in between were the bioeconomy policies, so changing into an economy which is based on natural resources or regenerating resources. What we see as well is the discourse on traditional forest knowledge coming in with the different needs on ecosystem services of forest, but as well the discourses on local community as a, well, proactive action. Even though there is some counter discourses, we can see those as well, challenging this perspective, drawing or giving too much responsibility to the communities as well. What we've seen as well is the illegal logging discourse, and we have seen that already as well in Connie's presentation when she was talking about the EU and the new instruments we have there. It is much more, well, awareness as well drawn to the corruption risk when it comes to illegal logging discussions. So the overall discourse observation we have seen in the last 14 years is the climate change discourse as all-embracing and dominating, putting value to nature, in particular to forest, or making a price ticket on it, and relying on market mechanism to fix those. We have seen as well counteracting, but an increasing demand for radical reorientation, which is demanding for more justice, more engagement. And of course, we see as well within these kind of dimensions, we have very different plots to navigate between. So some of those are more depolitized, which means like we give this kind of responsibility to the market. And on the other hand, some of those are quite politicized, giving, while talking about justice, engagement, fairness, and inclusions. For the future, we assume, and I have, after this week here at the UN building, I have decided to make it and highlight it further decreasing chances for common position and compromises, seeing that it is still not really easy to reach those, but it will be not in the future, because there is these different poles of discussions we have that are conflicting with each other. The second the other chapter I wanted to raise awareness to is the chapter 5, which is on critique. And you may ask why you focus only on the critique. Yeah, but there is a good reason, because many of those critiques, if you look into the scientific literature, is hidden between the lines. So there is lots of critiques on international forest governance, but it's not streamlined, it's not canalized, so it's really hard to identify those and really see what is a dominant critique and what is just at the borderline. And we try to organize this as well to make it better digestible. We have categorized it, therefore, in two groups. The one is the problem-solving critique, which is, in general, okay with the general system and with the general direction, but needed some fixes. And that is the other one, is a critical critique, which is more radical criticism. This is not so much about, well, really presenting problem-solving issues, but to uncover underlying power asymmetries and other conflicts that are there. But we will start with a problem-solving critique here. And there is 3 major critiques we have identified in the literature from the last 10 years. And the first one is the limited effectiveness. That is easy, that is sure, because we are talking about the comparison of governance against the standards of success or accomplishment. And what is done there is, well, we are talking about the performance of international forest governance. Usually when we talk about performance, it's about output, so what has been written there, what kind of regulations are coming out, about the outcome, how it has been implemented, and about the impact. And what we see in the literature is there's a strong focus on the limited effectiveness in the achievement of large-scale goals, meaning ending deforestation and degradation. And you can see here the figure from the FAO and from 2020 about the Global Forest Resource Assessment and the deforestation rate, which is sort of declining, but still deforestation is continuing. And we all know, and we have had these discussions for the full week now here, that this needs some responses. But this is not the only effectiveness that is missing. It's as well a missing effectiveness in the implementation. So there are lots of policies, but the question is how it is implemented and how can we really see those. And this is as well linking us to the second limits we see, and this is a limited evidence. We have a lot of missing linkages between the efforts and effects, because we have proposed, or here and international forest governance in general, many instruments have been proposed, but it is not clear how they are really affecting or how they really make an impact. And to ensure this, we would need a little more evidence about that and clarify as well those linkages. And this comes down to measuring and monitoring, and as well being clear about the criteria and indicator needed to ensure what are we really talking about, and are we already talking about the same here. The last critique, when it comes to the problem-solving critique, is the fragmentation, critique of fragmentation. And that has continued a lot since the 2010 report. That was already a major finding in 2010, that we have a great fragmentation. We have diverse areas where forest is really highly relevant. We know that there is forest discussed in the Paris Agreement, in UNFCCC, in the CBD, but in many other forums as well. We know as well that forests are discussed as well across the different horizontal regulations. So we have them internationally, we have them regionally, we have them at the nation state and at the subnational level. And sometimes there is incoherences and fragmentation coming about across this horizontal, vertical fragmentation. And what we see as well is a regionalization, and Connie has talked about that, parts of that at the EU, but as many other regions, having now their own forest regulations and their own standards. And partly this is leading, and this is criticized as well a lot, is leading to market distortions, and the problem with leakage effects of just regional outcomes is discussed a lot as a critique. So on the one hand, it is perceived as something good, that something is done on a different level, so not in the international, but giving it back to the regional level. And on the other hand, if it is only on the regional level, there will be lots of leakage effects we have to deal with in the future. So the second and the more, critical critique, a radical criticism here, is the one on justice. And I've included a citation from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who says, "Climate change is happening now and to all of us. No country or community is immune. And as is always the case, the poor and vulnerable are the first to suffer and the worst hit." And I think that very much signals already what this critique, this more critical critique, is about. But what we found in the literature, that it is not only about climate change, it is a lot about forest as well. That's very similar to the forest sector. And this is why we talk about, justice. That is one we found a lot in the literature. It is mainstreamed already in international forest governance processes. So we see points and goals concerning justice, but the literature says that this is mainstreamed, but still justice is persisting, and it's partly downscaled. So it is mentioned somehow, but it's not really implemented and partly not taken serious. And what is as well coming out of the literature is that we have lots of win-win narratives. If we see all these win-win narratives, let's say from forest landscape restoration, we are planting many trees, and Connie showed you these pledges and targets we have there, and it shows that we can save carbon and maybe we can save the world with the forest, and that is denied in the literature, saying there is not only winners with that, there are as well losers, and there are new trade-offs, and it's important to identify those and to uncover those in order to overcome them. A second critical critique is those on post-colonialism, which is an underlying dominance of certain countries over others, creating new dependencies. And it's still a lot about extractivism, but it's as well a lot about, giving away or shifting responsibilities from one country to another country, or from one region to another region of the world. So the question is, who has to deal with the responsibilities of climate change, for example? And then the question, and that is a continued question, and I know all of you have dealt with that a lot, is those on exclusions, which includes the legal rights, the tenure rights, but as well the social legitimate access. So on parts we have countries and we have regions and we have people who are socially legitimate to have access, but they don't have the legal rights. And that is confronted a lot in the literature and addressed. And there is And maybe that is a good point here to raise as well in the UNFF forum from this week, the missing inclusiveness in international negotiations. So we have 1 week behind us, and they were very often closed doors. So that is one issue that is not only discussed here, of course, but as well it has been discussed earlier on in the literature for many different processes we've seen. And the last one, maybe the most critical one, is the one on commodification. Is it possible to really do whatever we do on forest and what we should do in the future to have a commodification point of view, to put a price label on it, to privatize and to marketize? These are the critical critiques, concerns we have found in the literature. I don't want to go into these details you can see here. This is just to remind us that there was a 2010 report already telling us about the solutions and what we should do for the future. And we don't, of course, we don't want to get in conflict with our earlier colleagues. And we can just readdress and saying that's still appropriate and still it is not achieved. So we can still get back to that, a new diplomacy, which is an important issue. And a lot was addressed concerning learning and inter-arena coordination through learning, but as well leadership by policy entrepreneurs that is needed for the future. And a coordinated portfolio of policy instruments, because already at that time we were talking about fragmentation, and we need to lots more coordination to hinder trade-offs that are existing. At the same time, the last report was hinting towards a new learning architecture and establishing a learning platform and making use of e-governance tools and entrepreneurs. But now we come back to our report here, and we have not now here for this presentation, not detailed those that have been already detailed in the other report, but we are more centered now on the radical alternatives that are proposed in the literature. And one of those more radical alternatives is the people-centered approach. It sounds rather trivial because it says strengthening democratic institutions with equal participation opportunities. It sounds like an easy get and a low-hanging fruit to get, and we should all have already democratic institutions installed. But still, we see exclusion even in international governance fora when it is about the negotiation of people's rights and people's further needs. Another approach that was proposed is the polycentric governance with independent centers, with many independent centers, but that are or should be connected in an interdependent system. So allow at different levels, in different situations, different decision making, but what is needed is a connection and a coordination at some spaces, rather than having another instrument laying down on the others. And of course, participation via surveys have been quite informative as well in former times to allow a little more deliberation, to allow a little more inclusiveness and getting people into the decision-making procedures. Even more radical seems to be the discursive change because it's uncomfortable for politics to signal that we might not only talk about easy solutions like planting trees and ending, even though it seems to be not as easy as we thought, ending deforestation, but reducing and or localizing consumption and production might be an issue that needs to be taken up as well, even though it is uncomfortable for all of us. And the other issue that is always raised as an alternative is setting prices on environmental and social externalities. So not only setting prices on, well, how can we store carbon and so carbon sequestration, but as well on those unintended effects that come about with those. So we are nearly at the end of this presentation, and I tried to, well, find some conclusions, which are not the conclusions of the report, but trying to, well, get a little bit to this target audience here. What can we do has been the questions of the media reporters, and that might be the question as well you ask, and that is consider alternatives to simplified standards of success, so only the deforestation rate is not really qualifying to say a lot. It says something, but it doesn't say anything behind the quality of international forest governance and its real comprehensive effectiveness. And consider alternatives to win-win narratives and target Olympics by shifting to a more people-sensitive approaches and consider those as well in the discussions. It's not an easy take because it's much easier to talk about, well, figures and strong numbers than about critical qualitative issues about justice and fairness. But I assume that many of us are capable to do so, and we have the need to really not reduce it too much and make it too easy. Another one might be reviewing the increasing and complex financialization landscape, and Connie was presenting this in depth, including the focus on growth and short-term benefits and foster alternative finances. In particular now, when we talk about carbon storage, this becomes a highly relevant issue, and I assume we need to look much deeper into that as well in the future. And last but not least, recognizing and counteracting the climatization discourse dominating all other needs and goals and all other priorities we set in the international forest governance arena. Last but not least, I wanted to acknowledge the silences and the blind spots. Silences among institutions and actors in international forest governance, so here, but in many other forums as well. But I want to acknowledge as well the silences in our report, because we have to be self-critical as well as researchers. We have, among the authors, even though we tried hard to be as broad as we could, geographically and disciplinary, we are not really covering the globe. And we can't, because we are limited when it comes to languages, we are limited when it comes to disciplines. And the limited ability to include evidence across many languages is as well something we have to cover when we talk about this. We want to respond to that by embedding these results we have of these results in a broader discussion with you, but as well later on with different stakeholders in order to get a feedback and, well, to get a little bit of limits to our limitations. So thank you very much, of course, for your attention, to all authors of this report, to the reviewers and those facilitating, and in particular IUFRO. And if you like to scan the report, you can do so by the QR code behind me. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniela, and also thank you, Connie McDermott, for this really excellent presentations and for really nicely setting the scene for further discussions. We thought it would be really helpful if we ask stakeholders to respond to the findings of this report. And so we have invited two of them. And for that, I hand over to my colleague, Nelson Grima, who will introduce them.
Thank you, Christoph. Yes, I would like to start introducing Ms. Tina Rutila. Ms. Rutila is Senior Ministerial Advisor for Forestry at the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland. Ms. Rutila has a background in forestry by the University of Helsinki and has extensive experience as a high-level advisor in both the public and the private sectors. We ask Ms. Rutila to provide some insights to our assessment from the point of view of policymaking. Tina, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm addressing you on behalf of my colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, who have had a partnership agreement with UFRO since 2006. This agreement has provided the basis for long-term collaboration, and we believe this has also enabled continuity in the planning and development of UFRO's activities. From the onset, Finnish scientific institutions have been key partners of the partnership. The collaboration between UFRO and Finland has facilitated a cost-effective way for producing assessment reports and policy briefs based on up-to-date scientific research and effective dissemination of the material to several international processes. It supports sustainable forest-related development and livelihoods through international collaboration in knowledge generation and exchange. This has been complemented by capacity building for scientists and practitioners at national and local levels. This is particularly important for professionals from developing countries who might have limited opportunities for scientific engagement. For example, during the last 5 years, support from Finland has enabled around 180 scientists from Africa, Asia, and Latin America to participate in UFRO's conferences and workshops and become involved in UFRO's science policy and other thematic programs. We particularly appreciate the significant share, about 50%, of women among the grantees. The involvement of Natural Resource Institute Finland as a subcontractor in UFRO's activities aligns with the Finnish government's development policy, which states that in developing countries, the government will promote sustainable forestry and afforestation projects utilizing Finnish expertise, as well as other projects that involve local living conditions and increase the global carbon sink. Open access policy of UFRO products and information is valuable. Free and open access is an important means of increasing the distribution of the results and outcomes of UFRO's work. Today, credible research publishers globally are increasingly adopting open access policy. We also appreciate the value added and increased media publicity that the launching of UFRO's publications have provided for international forestry events, such as the UNFF and other United Nations conferences. UFRO's work has addressed a vacuum in international forest-related processes by enabling the production of high-quality peer-reviewed synthesis of scientific information, such as the report launched today. The presented report recognizes that while forests are important for climate change mitigation and adaptation, they should also be prioritized for long-term market-based investments and for ensuring a sustainable future for the communities depending on them. I thank you for this opportunity to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for your words, and also thank you to the Finnish government for their continued support to UFRO and to make reports like this possible. Now, our next speaker could not come here in person, but she has also sent a recording. She is Natalie Four. She is currently the forest governance lead at the company Ethic Wood, based in Belgium. And previously, she worked many years as a senior program officer at REC of TC, leading the organization's work on governance and rights in Southeast Asia. Ms. Ford has a background in law and many years of experience advising governments and empowering NGOs to engage in decision-making processes in Asia and Africa. Her areas of expertise include community forestry, governance and trade, communities' rights, access to justice, and gender. And now, please, the video.
Good afternoon. My name is Natalie Four. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So I'll be sharing my experience with you working on forest governance processes in Africa and Asia over the last 15 years, and also sharing some thoughts in relation to two instruments of governance I've been directly involved with. So I will be illustrating trends from global to regional forest governance. So first, looking at key trends from the reports that I'd like to illustrate, it's quite key to mention that over the last decade, social dimensions of forests have been more of a focus in terms of the content of interventions. So for example, looking at the topic of social forestry, that have been more of the focus, especially in certain areas and regions in the world, such as Asia and Africa. But there's also been an increased participation of different groups in the design of governance processes, such as the participation of different actors like civil society, but also the private sector. So we'll look at key examples of this in the two instruments I mentioned. One other key trend that is highlighted by the report is the fact that governance has been focused on markets, and that there has been two major shifts. One, which is from the focus on legality of the production of forest products, but also, from legality to sustainability, but also from a timber-focused area to forestry's commodities interventions. So we'll come back to that as well. And finally, I'd like to illustrate the trend of looking at forest governance from a more global perspective, to look at and to understand the trends towards more regional, bilateral, and unilateral approaches. It's important to also mention that while these different approaches are developed, they also overlap. So I would like to start with this quite heavy diagram looking at the complexity of forest governance, and particularly the complexity of issues. For example, here we're talking about the deforestation issue. We could also look at conservation, look at other key challenges that we have in forest governance overall. But looking at deforestation in particular, we can see that there's a number of drivers of deforestation in the world today, and a complexity not only of those issues, but of the types of responses that are available to us. So this is just to highlight the fact that this complexity of issues calls for a multiplicity of solutions, both at the global level, but also at the regional and national level. These solutions have to be adapted to the context and to the specific problem, so we will come back to that. So solutions might include approaches and tools at the national level, such as national targets and commitments, a landscape approach at the field level, and a range of other approaches and instruments. Today, I would like to focus on two instruments at the international and regional levels that could be potential solutions and that have had quite a unique approach in terms of forest governance. Those are approaches that look at the sustainable supply chains of forest products, approaches based on legislation and due diligence, and also looking at regional standards that can enable the integration of certain topics by different states at the regional level. So looking first at sustainable supply chains, there's a range of instruments targeting the production and trade of forest products that have been developed over the last decade, both in order to tackle illegal logging, but also deforestation. So those instruments have included sector-specific initiatives, like in the case of timber. So you can see here there's been different initiatives and legislations taken by different states, both on the consumer market level. For example, the EU timber regulation that's been adopted about 10 years ago now in 2013, but also from the producing market perspective, like timber legality assurance systems, like in Vietnam. Interestingly, these sector-specific initiatives have also been corroborated by trade agreements, and in particular, we'll be looking today at the EU Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade Voluntary Partnership Agreements, so the VPAs, that have been signed between the EU and forested countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So those are a group of instruments, particularly trying to focus on the legal trade of timber. In the more recent years, there's also been a shift from this sector-specific initiative focused on timber to a deforestation approach, and looking at different forest risk commodities overall that can help tackle deforestation. That's both legal and illegal deforestation. So we can mention, for example, the EU Zero Deforestation Regulation that's been adopted in 2023, but also similar legislations in the UK and in the US. What's interesting to notice is this focus from a single commodity, such as timber, to a multiple commodity approach, including cattle, cocoa, coffee, and other broad commodities, trying to tackle deforestation overall, and also this shift from the legality of these of the production of these products to a more broadly sustainability approach. So I'd like to zoom in on the FLECT approach, and then to present one element of a regional instrument. So looking at the FLECT approach, this is quite a unique approach, which is bilateral in its design, but has a global reach with 10 countries that have currently signed a VPA across the globe today. Why is this approach unique? So the FLECT voluntary partnership agreements approach is quite unique in the sense that it has brought civil society and the private sector at the negotiation table together with governments and the EU. So this participatory design and participatory process has enabled actors that in the past were not associated to governance processes to have a say and voice their concerns. Secondly, it has also had an interesting focus not only on sanitizing the supply chain in terms of the production and trade of products, but also looking to improve forest governance overall and governance in these producing countries. So this has enabled a series of reform at the legislative, regulatory level, which touch on forest areas, but have also had an impact in terms of land use, including the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in legislation, and broadening the scope in terms of looking at the forest products, so looking at justice, trade, and other aspects. So the key challenge of this approach, however, has been setting up a traceability system and a monitoring system to be able to make it fully effective. There's currently an EU FLECT VPA program that's being implemented by the French Development Cooperation, AFD, that is providing some support to 8 of the 10 countries that have signed a VPA across the globe to enable this implementation. So I think the FLECT approach can be quite interesting as a tool to look at as a tool of forest governance that has enabled better participation, transparency at the local level, but also the participation of civil society and other actors to negotiations, and being able for them to bring on the table of negotiations issues that have to do with rights of communities, social issues, local conflicts, and so on, which is very innovative in the sense of looking at the trade agreement. So secondly, after looking at this hybrid bilateral but global reach instrument, which is FLECT, I'd like to share with you an experience which is a little bit more recent and has been based on the development of voluntary standards at the regional level in ASEAN. I have been working with RECOFT in the past to develop and to provide support to the ASEAN member states to develop the guiding principles on social forestry, effective legal frameworks. So these standards are voluntary standards that have been adopted by the ASEAN member states, the 10 member states, in October 2022. And they have as an objective to provide some guidance to member states in Asia on what could be the principle to take into account in their legislation. Why is this approach unique? Because it is a unique collaboration between political, economical cooperation, which is ASEAN, together with 2 NGOs, RECOFT and Client Earth, working together through a cross-country learning process to understand what is social forestry for different countries in Asia, and being able to outlay key principles for states to be able to take those into account and to have a roadmap when they're looking at changing their legislation, for example. This process supports national targets of the countries in the region, and they constitute the very first regional standards in the world on social forestry legal frameworks. That also supports the rights of indigenous people and local communities. I would say that the key challenge of this initiative has been the financial support for the implementation of these guiding principles, as I mentioned above, they are voluntary principles. So I would like to finish by sharing with you some thoughts on the key elements for success of these initiatives whether they're at the global level, but focusing more maybe now on regional and bilateral agreements and instruments. First, it's very important to look at multiple solutions to these major complex deforestation issues. As we have seen before, it's important to ensure that these initiatives, while being quite tailored in the context, are complementary and also include a multi-stakeholder approach. Of course, one country or one actor cannot do it all, so it is important to make sure that those are connected. Adapting solutions to the context is key, and this is why the ASEAN regional principles are quite embedded into the region and enable an adaptation to the local context and regional context. And those initiatives must link, of course, global, regional, and national engagements of these countries. I would mention maybe two challenges or aspects to work on. More data is needed in terms of looking at the impact of specific interventions and also how to scale up those interventions. And finally, more support needed at the implementation stage once these instruments are adopted to be able to actually implement them and make them fully effective on the ground. I will leave you at this. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I wish you a very fruitful session today and a good end of the day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Natalie, for your words from the implementing perspective. Now we would still have some time for questions from the audience. So I would like to open the floor to the audience if anyone has questions. Yes, I see a question over there. Please state your name and affiliation before you state the question. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists. My name is Matteo, representing Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and also part of the major group as part of the NGO community. Timely presentation. Congratulations to IUFRO for the publication. Just two questions. First one, about the regulatory landscape. There was an example of the European Union, but also in the EU, the forest regulatory landscape is scattered. It's sufficient to notice that when it comes to forestry matters, also at national level, forests always fall within two ministries. So agriculture and forestry, but also other kinds of ministries. So by nature, the landscape is pretty scattered. So the first question is not an easy question at all, and that's the reason why we are here. It's how do we harmonize all this landscape? What would be the best solution? And the second comment I have, the second comment/question, is that Natalie, in her speech, she mentioned the importance of having multiple solutions. And I would say definitely, also because deforestation and degradation are complex challenges, but we don't have necessarily to come up with new solutions. Sometimes it's also important to combine solutions that we already have. And in an example, it's really about this market-based approach. Usually the narrative is one or the other. So either legislation or voluntary sustainability action. But the two are not mutually exclusive. They're rather mutually supportive. So any thoughts on how we can actually combine and join forces between mandatory action and voluntary action? This is what actually this is actually our position at the Forest Stewardship Council. So we're definitely law first, always first, but we're ready to support. Thank you so much for this timely publication. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for your words and also for your question. Definitely, these are two very important questions, and maybe Daniela wants to. Okay.
I give it a try, and I assume if I can answer your first question, I'll get the Nobel Prize directly here on stage, right? So I absolutely agree with you. It is scattered, or as the report says, it is fragmented across horizons, across the vertical, across the horizontal, and it needs coordination between those, and it needs learning across those. And but we don't know exactly how to harmonize, but we assume that it needs an organizational effort to do so. So it's not so much needed another new instrument, as you were asking or already stated in your second question. I think it will not help having another instrument and another instrument, putting them on each other, because the others are not sort of deleted for that reason. So it's just adding on to complexity. It's somehow, we are still focusing on trying the one and only solution, the one size fits all solution. And I think it's very hard to get the point that we will not find it. So we have to live with the different solutions we have, with the different instruments and stage, but we need organization across those, which means like there needs an institutional effort to really get those combined with each other. The regulatory ones, those are governmental actions, as well as the non-governmental actions, finding both together and trying to identify the trade-offs between them. It has to be serious, and it has to be clear that there are trade-offs as well, but to identify those is maybe the first step to get in the direction. So this was an answer, trying to get both questions addressed.
Yeah, I just want to add one sentence. I think, and this cross-sectional coordination needs to start, needs to go through all levels, and needs to start at the national level, and this institutional structural efforts. I guess this is very important.
Thank you. Well, those, as you mentioned, were not easy questions, but I hope the answers could help somehow. Next question, Robert, please.
You hear me? Yeah.
No.
Yeah. This whole issue of the discourse, it's very interesting, because if you have been sitting in this room for the last 4 days, everybody said we need more science to support our policies, and we all know that unfortunately nobody wants to pay. So is it enough to have an analysis of the discourse, or do we need also to look at, and to which extent this discourse translates into action? That's the first question. And the second question is, how much of what is happening really in forests depends on forest governance, or depends on financial governance, perverse incentive, or the policies of the agricultural sector?
Thank you for the questions. Daniela, yes?
Okay, I'll try with the first question, and then I have to ask you for a little bit of a repetition of the second one, so that I get it right. Well, we were all very happy to see that it is acknowledged that there is more need for science as well in international forest governance. That's clear, because it's legitimizing our roles and why we are here. So that is important. But I absolutely agree with you that it is, well, it can be only a first step to say, well, we are revising the literature and tell you what has been, well, what is at stake in science. And then it has to be translated in political decision. But it's of course not us in the political decisions, and sometimes we are not even heard within these discussions. So it is a first step to show that, but in future it is needed to go into stronger, well, let's say dialogue between political decision makers at the different level, at the international level, but as well at the regional level, together with the scientific organizations we have, and well, to identify exactly the critiques as a starting point for maybe finding alternatives together as well. And for the second question, Robert, I'm sorry, I have to ask you.
I was make it simple. To which extent the fate of forest depends on forest governance, or the governance of other sector outside the forestry sector?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that is exactly one of the questions we had. That is a question about the evidence. How can we say how it is evidence? What we do here, what is done here in UNFF, what is done in all the other forums, how has this created the deforestation rate? What is the impact of that? And we can't exactly say what is really at stage. Is it now the new rules? And well, some policies try more than others to identify and get an evidence and get monitoring for it, but very often we don't do that. So we are not measuring what is done and how is it really related to the practices we see in the end. So I assume it's very hard to answer that question, whether it is international forest governance being responsible for the fade or for the non-fade, for both of those, and what is directly the linkage. But I think these linkages, we have to concentrate much more of that, these causal linkages, and to identify when we have an instrument. Well, releasing an instrument is one part, and politically, it is very nicely to release an instrument because it's always in success if you could sign something and you can shake hands afterwards. We do that as well. Afterwards, we shake hands. So that always looks good. But in the end, it is not just having a good-looking picture, but as well to identify what does it mean for implementation, and what does it mean if I really have to evaluate whether it has resulted into something or not.
Yeah, please.
Ready? Thank you very much. Really a very inspiring even presentations, and you have give us great information about many things. And partly my question has been in response already, but I would like to insist in something else. First of all, it would be very interested to see the results of the study that you have made around REDD+ 2. I mean REDD+ in 2022, because one of the initiatives around REDD+ was precisely to help to support countries to betterment the forest governance. And when you talk about the forest governance, I started to think about, are you talking about forestry governance, forest governance, or governance as a whole? Because as you have said now, perhaps the solutions are outside the forest arena, and that is why we have been insisting on tackling the underlying causes of deforestation and forest degradation, because some of them are precisely outside the forest. So we should not talk about only forest governance. And we have to be, as you have said, to identify who are the key actors and in the different levels. Yeah? And one of them, for instance, is precisely the people who live in the forest. And here we were very surprised that, for instance, things that are tackled precisely to this kind of governance is the rights, right tenure, land tenure rights, the water rights. Who has the rights over carbon, for instance? Yeah? And actually there is, again, a legal instrument, and most of the countries have recognized, because it's one of the ILO Convention's rules, which is the EPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, which is crucial to deal with this kind of stakeholders that have to take decisions, because governance is dealing with decisions, making decisions. So we have to be clear who is going to take the decisions in which level. And I think that the information that you have shared with us is quite inspiring, because I know that perhaps you are tackling this, and when you have said about the critiques, the limits, and so on and so forth, I think that you are taking into account that. So to finish, yes, somebody says that during this week we have discussed a lot of things, but actually I would like to see them in the documents that the governments are going to approve this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention, and we are running out of time, so if you want to reply to this very quickly.
Very briefly, thanks a lot. First of all, REDD+, that was part of our research as well, or the review as well, saying that with the REDD+, lots of countries and national level is strengthened, but not the people living within the countries. So that is a difference, and maybe we should be aware of that. I'm very happy for you recognizing the differences between forestry governance and forest governance. We call it forest governance and forest-related governance, which means like it is much broader than forest, but well, as I said earlier, it is in different arenas, and they are as well doing governance which has an effect on forest. And one last statement, which is very important for me too, because we are talking a lot about forest-dependent people. And well, actually, I think we are all forest-dependent people, but some are in more close proximity than others. So maybe we should, well, take this note as well. Thanks a lot for this intervention.
Thank you, Marta. We run out of time now, so I would like to thank you all for being here. We don't have any more time. They will kick us out. So, the report is free to download from our webpage, and hard copies can be ordered from UFRO headquarters. And the recording of this session will be in the UFRO YouTube channel shortly. Thank you all for being here, and yep.
Thank you.
And once again, I would very much like to thank our team at UFRO and the assessment team, in particular Daniela and Connie for their presentations. I'd like to also just thank the discussants for their very, very insightful comments and presentations, and of course all of you who were so attentive and offered some very very pertinent observations and questions. So thank you all.